and Happy New Year. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio for the first episode of the year. For those newly joining the program, this is a great time to join. My name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Robert Evan Ellis. He's the Latin America research professor at U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. He focuses on the regional relationships with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crimes and populism in the region. And today we'll be focusing mostly on China's military and security presence in the region, how much of it is real, how much of it is optics versus an actual security threat to the US, to the region. Dr. Ellis recently wrote an article about China's involvement in Nicaragua, but China's involvement in Latin America far extends that. Earlier last year, we heard reports about a Chinese intelligence base allegedly being developed in Cuba. We've heard many other rumors and reports about double-use infrastructure in various Latin American countries. Today, we'll zero in on all of that. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis, for joining our program today. If you could tell us a little bit more about yourself, your professional background, and how you came to be doing this type of research, that would be great.
Thanks, Rena. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you here today. So a little bit about my background. I'm currently the Latin America research professor at the U.S. Army War College, as you indicated. I've actually been following Chinese activities in Latin America for a little over 20 years now. After I got my PhD, I began in the private sector working in support of defense and other clients. That was when I began to track in the early 2000s what was going on with China, both from a commercial perspective and also trying to communicate to some of my Department of Defense colleagues what was significant about that. In 2009, I had the opportunity to take a position as the head of Spanish language gaming at the strategic level with our defense partners in Latin America at something called the William J. Perry Center. So I was there for about 6 years, where I continued my scholarship on China, Latin America, as well as deepening my work with our defense partners. I then took a position in 2014, of course, my present position as the research professor at the Army War College, which really goes beyond just actually teaching at the War College itself, which is a fantastic place, but also goes to supporting DoD and U.S. government more broadly. In 2019 to 2020, I also had the honor of spending a year at the State Department. I was the Western Hemisphere affairs person on the policy planning staff of the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. And so, again, that gave me an opportunity to see a little bit about how the diplomatic portion of our machinery as a complement to our Defense Department works. And so a little bit about myself, continue to be very passionate about the Latin America and its well-being and its connection to the United States, and how what happens there affects us profoundly, whether it's having to do with China or other interactions or conditions in the region.
So I am going to start with what may seem like a very basic question, but one that I think many people who are not professionals in the area are asking themselves every day whenever they hear about China in Latin America in the headlines. Why is China interested in such a faraway and volatile region with a history of corruption, extreme economic mismanagement, and defaults on their loans and investments?
Well, it's a great question, Rina. And certainly with global interdependence, nothing is entirely far away these days. But for me, it is mostly about economics, but that does not make it any the less impactful for the region or for the United States to which we are connected. So in general, what you could see is distinct phases. As China continued to expand, it needed secure access to commodities as well as foodstuffs to fuel industrialization, to fuel its industrial machine, and also access to markets going ever beyond just the developed country markets to very various others throughout the world. Now, in 2008, as China continued those largely trade-based relationships with the global financial crisis, it found that it had opportunities and also a need to begin to move to have more of a established position with its companies on the ground in Latin America. And so through mergers and acquisitions, again, largely pursuing economic opportunities, you began to see the increased presence in the mining sector, in the petroleum sector, various agricultural logistics projects, but also expanding in telecom, companies such as Huawei, et cetera. Now, while you could say, well, these are largely economic focus and indeed responds to the economic imperatives of those companies in China. But behind that, there's also an understanding that China in many ways is trying to re-wicker the world to its own economic benefit, going back to its concept as really the center of the universe, trying to orchestrate flows of wealth and value to China, getting the things that it needs from the world. But in the process of doing that, it recognizes that it is engaged with the international system that was not entirely of its own making. I mean, we're familiar with the origin of the current financial and political structures, not only the United Nations but the Bretton Woods financial system. And so, little by little, as China has engaged, they've tried to also get involved in global institutions in the region to make them at least not entirely adversarial and where possible, actually beneficial to their engagements. It has also began through a series of bilateral political engagements. Through, for example, establishing strategic partnerships and associated vehicles to try to enlist governments to help it. Of course, one of the other pieces of that was the fact that in those political engagements, China recognized early on that a big chunk of the countries in the world that continue to recognize what it regards as a breakaway province, Taiwan, were located in Latin America. Indeed, today, although the number has dwindled down quite a bit over the past couple of years, you have 7 of the 13 countries in the world that continue to recognize Taiwan located in the region, especially in the Caribbean and in Central America. So that goes beyond even the economics. But I would also say that with respect to understanding that the region is important, if China ever has to fight a conflict with the United States, and we see China's ambitions expanding, it understands that having a presence and the types of strategic opportunities that commercial presence gives it in the region, and the importance of also developing ties with Latin American militaries are important, not because it has a master plan to take over Latin America, aka the Soviet Union, but responsible actors within the People's Liberation Army, et cetera, need to think about, well, how would they, as part of their globalization, fight a war fight, and thus, what type of opportunities should they pursue to take advantage of that growing commercial presence? So it is mostly about economics, but at the end of the day, again, it's profoundly transforming the region. It has significant implications for the security of the United States. And frankly, it affects the dynamics in Latin America in terms of political dynamics, how people respond to the United States, who benefits from patterns of ownership and economic activity. It has an impact on the life cycle of democracy and populist regimes in the region, and a variety of other things. And so sometimes we wrestle with saying, okay, even though it's mostly about economics, but in many ways it is affecting the politics, it's affecting the well-being, it's affecting the political stability of the region, it's affecting the relationship with the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And so it continues to be ever more important both for the region and for the United States.
Just how extensive is this Chinese economic and business penetration of these spheres, and why is it there's this, sub-Rosa element of anti-American spirit there, even as we are talking about very general commercial interests that any country would have and that are fairly normal in a competitive global economy? It seems like Taiwan is an issue. It seems like there is a push of an anti-American political spirit that you just mean. Why would that be the case if all China is trying to do is expand its own economic opportunities?
Well, first of all, it's not just that China acts like any other actor. China is very different than the way that the European Union engages the region, in what ways that U.S. companies might regard as competitors. It's very different than the way that Japanese or Korean companies, which have been in the region since the 1970s, engage. And there are core issues that have to do with how the Chinese companies engage, oftentimes with the lack of respect for intellectual property, oftentimes with their companies trying to push the limit as far as they can with respect to, as you alluded to before, companies where there are weak government oversight and high levels of corruption. Thus, at the end of the day, the Chinese essentially dealing with local elites end up really getting the better of many of those deals. But it also has to do with the scale of that Chinese engagement as it interacts with Latin America. But with respect to the first part of your question, the relative amounts, again, the relationship started out mostly as trade, although it's gotten into more investment, and that patterns of that investment have evolved. So in terms of trade itself, in 2022, that trade was a little bit less than $500 billion, which if you take away Mexico and parts of Central America, essentially every place from about Costa Rica south, China is either the number one trading partner or the number two trading partner behind Brazil, with the United States being number three. In terms of non-financial foreign direct investment, you have somewhere on the order of about $190 billion of Chinese FDI. About half of that goes into Brazil. Various amounts go in other countries. And of course, on top of that, you have the loans, both by Chinese policy banks and Chinese commercial banks. That was about $135 billion accumulated just from China's two leading policy banks from about 2005. Now, some can say, well, those amounts in some ways are a little bit less than the United States. But it really is less about the actual amounts than how those quantities and projections of future benefit impact the behavior of Latin American politicians and business people. The expectation of essentially, getting rich if one, only gets a Chinese business partner or gets access to the vast Chinese market, although with non-financial and other barriers, that's oftentimes more difficult than one would think. But what you see happening then is that you have a variety of different responses, from responses by relatively strongly institutionalized pro-U.S. Countries to those who are ideologically more anti-U.S. And so China means different things to different people, and China is more than happy with that. But on the well-institutionalized side of the spectrum, if you look at a country like Chile or Uruguay, who has done fairly well in exporting and managing the relationship through relatively transparent, strong institutions, but even there, the power of China impacts how those countries behave, both in terms of the internal politics of their systems, as well as the degree to which they feel a compulsion to go along with the United States. I mean, there's once an era in which U.S. institutions, U.S. investors, Western multilateral institutions such as the International Monetary Fund could say, hey, we really believe that the right thing to do is to be fiscally responsible and transparent and have a good business case for the money that you want to loan, which was something that, as anybody who's tried to go to a bank, who has a maybe not so well developed idea of why they need the money knows. The banker is often there not pleasantly to keep you from getting yourself into deeper trouble. In many ways, Western institutions play that role. China has come with a different approach, often saying, okay, we'll give you the money as long as we'll structure the deal to make sure that China gets paid. We don't care what you do with your other investors. We don't care, whether the project itself makes financial sense. We're going to make sure that we get paid either by securitizing it with parallel deliveries of commodities in the case of countries like Venezuela or Ecuador or other things. And so in many ways, what that involvement has done is it's hijacked those countries who really didn't want to have to adhere to good financial practices or transparency, and it's given them an alternative. Now, as you also alluded to, within Latin America, as you've had for reasons having nothing to do with China, the frustration of political systems with the performance of democracy and its inability to resolve issues of insecurity and inequality and things like that. We've seen these cycles of leftist leaders. Some of them leftist democratic, as we saw initially with Lula in Brazil in the early 2000s, or the Concertación in Chile, among others, or Frente Amplio in Uruguay. In other cases, more authoritarian populists, as we've seen with Venezuela, Nicaragua, with the Ortegas, etc. But essentially what has happened is, with those more authoritarian states, especially, Chinese money, although largely benefiting China and the elites, has provided enough resources that has allowed those populist states to be able to continue to move against the private sector, to turn away from the United States, without some of the costs, the financial costs that would otherwise accompany that. And so in many ways, China has helped. While it's not like the Soviet Union, where you had the Soviet Union explicitly trying to push for a communist regime, China basically doing well for itself, looking for its own interest, really basically provided the money that allowed populist anti-democratic states to survive and consolidate power. And so that's impacted the tenure of the region. So at the end of the day, when you say, well, why does it matter? Again, it is, in part, it's impacted the interest or willingness of many countries to really cooperate with what we oftentimes forget are good reasons for pursuing good governance and transparency and democracy and things like that. It is facilitated the proliferation of authoritarian regimes. It is, in some ways, also created spaces for that could be used, the commercial projects that could be used in times of war against the United States or against U.S. allies in the region. It's created certain risks in pursuit of its own interests of espionage. China just has come to dominate the digital spaces in the region. Companies like Huawei, and that's been there for over 20 years, 3G, 4G, of course, now 5G, cable systems, telephones, but as well as security systems by companies like Hikvision, port scanners, e-commerce, the list just goes on and on. Even the digital domains of rideshare companies like Didi Chuxing, all of which, given that China, with its 2017 national security law, basically obliges these companies to turn over data that's relevant to the Chinese state, it begins to put at risk the ability of these companies and countries to make sovereign decisions. And so, that creates issues. And then, frankly, for Latin America, for the long term, there's also a question of who benefits from the resources and work of Latin America, and who pays the price for the consequences. I remember when I used to teach a graduate level course at the University of Miami in 2006, 2007, I would have my students read a little bit from world systems theorist Emmanuel Wallerstein and dependencia theorist Raul Prebisch, just to see that if they would make the connection between the writings back then, because those writings back in the day when it was focused on the United States, it was the question of whether or not Latin America would benefit from its own resources. And in many ways, what you see today is that China, in structuring these deals in ways that benefit the elites, but ultimately it captures the value added of extracting the region's resources, and then it extracts the benefit from selling back to the region its manufacturers, its cars, its electric vehicles, and dominating key technology sectors. At the end of the day, the region has only had limited success with realizing the value added for itself, even under relatively good Western, companies, although with their problems. But the level to which the Chinese are really capturing the value added of the fruits of Latin America goes an order of magnitude beyond the worst that the West was ever accused of. And so those are some of the reasons why, even though it's just business, for me, it's a strategic concern, because we live with this region and the consequences of what happened in this region, as we've seen. seen from, when, immigration becomes such an issue that it impacts U.S. elections, the drugs that, kill, 106,000 people last year with drug overdoses. And so, although sometimes we like to focus on other parts of the world, when things go well or go badly here, they become a matter not of foreign policy, but they become a matter of U.S. domestic policy because of the way they affect us. And so for me, that's why what's happening with China transforming the region is deeply concerning, although mostly about commerce.
At what point has the US or elements of the US government, I'm very careful to say, started perceiving China as a strategic threat? Because I have seen a split in US institutions on this issue between Pentagon and some of the security agencies on the one hand, and the State Department, Commerce, the White House administrations on the other. And why is there such a disconnect?
Sure. No, it's a great question. And I've watched this evolve over the years, and there's always been a certain level of discomfort. I remember back when, during the Bush administration, back in the early 2000s, you had Roger Noriega, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, who testified, again, as a Republican, that China was a concern, but the U.S. engagement was still much larger. Under successive Democratic administrations, I watched, that people like Assistant Secretary of State Arturo Valenzuela, Roberta Jacobson, who expressed increasing concern. We even had then Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton back in, I believe, 2009, talking about the threat from China. But in general, we were still, I think, weighing our attitudes towards China. I mean, we had supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. The U.S. was still of mixed mind whether the engagement with China with the world would transform it, make it more democratic, or is those who worried about it, that engagement would actually make it more powerful and more dangerous, and later turn more authoritarian, which ultimately was what happened. So I think a key moment was the 2017 national security strategy. And so, as you recall, with the election of President Trump, and to me, it's important to distinguish, it wasn't just President Trump. People have a variety of feelings about President Trump, but just remembering that a large number of some pretty bright center-right thinkers came to power, and it was many of those people who put together really, how do we now see this evolving challenge? And so the 2017 NSS, which recognized China really as a strategic competitor very explicitly, and then from state, when you had then Secretary Rex Tillerson, then with that license to kind of begin a dialogue that pushed back against China. And I think those early attempts were regarded as somewhat ineffective because our Latin American partners just wanted business with China. They believed they can control the risk, and so the U.S. messaging that China bad was seen as it was okay. Thanks, we get it. Okay, let's talk about something else. But as you also pointed out, different organizations see things in different ways, and so certainly I think the U.S. military, and again, recalling that the U.S. military, who I have long supported throughout my own professional career, its professional responsibility is to prepare for the defense of this nation and to fight where necessary this nation's wars. And so I think when you begin looking at China from that lens, when you start saying, okay, well, they are having this digital presence, how could that be used or exploited against both the U.S. and against our regional partners? Okay, they are building these port facilities that could have, as General Richardson, the commander of U.S. Southern Command, refers to a dual use capability. They are getting involved in having access to Latin American space facilities, which has strategic implications in terms of what you can see and what you can do in the skies over the Western Hemisphere. Again, so when you start looking at a wartime lens, what China is doing, even though it looks mostly commercial, although not entirely, becomes increasingly of concern. And so I think one can say that state and DoD have different perspectives based on what they're focused on, and obviously the different personalities and different governments involved. Although I'll tell you frankly also that even with a different flavor, having spent a year on the policy planning staff at State Undersecretary Pompeo, state is also very worried and very concerned about the China challenge globally and very focused on how to respond. There are, thinkings about, how, and some of those responses tend to emphasize opportunity for cooperation, but also messages increasingly effective about the predatory nature of Chinese activities, attempt through things like the Development Finance Corporation to provide alternatives. Now, there are difficulties with both the messaging and with U.S. resources and the way the U.S. alternatives are perceived. But I think certainly in recent years, you can see state trying to work in its own way, in its own style, also to try to do its part in what is called strategic competition.
Let's face it, I think it's very arguable that US has been failing on many fronts in Latin America. And we see that by the number of allies who have divested from Taiwan. We see it by the disparate reaction to US involvement versus China involvement. And you mentioned it earlier that there was a great deal of outrage and anti-colonialist sentiment with respect to US. And we can argue about US foreign policy and how effective that's been. But China, whatever US has done, China is objectively far worse. It has outright colonialist practices around the world, not just in Latin America. So the question is, what exactly has gone wrong with the US structure, with the US perception of responses to threats? It understands that it has found itself outplayed in its own sphere of influence, its own territory.
Several great questions. And so first of all, certainly, the U.S., has a very mixed track record in its history in Latin America, and the temptation that when one becomes powerful, how one regards what it has the privilege or right to do is been a problem for us as well as other actors. Having said that, I think in many ways the U.S., if you really look at the record, has not been entirely a bad partner in terms of the advocacy for democracy. Again, with difficulties, but the role of the U.S. as an economic partner in terms of its investments, in terms of the value added that it leaves in Latin America when it has those trade relationships. But with respect to what's happening with right now with China, number one, I think important to recognize that the U.S. is at certain inherent disadvantages in engaging the region, especially in a transactional fashion. So number one, basically as a largely market-driven economy, the United States does not have the levers that China has to strategically invest or take credit for investment. So whereas China has enormous control over its state-owned enterprises, although not everything is state-owned, and although China has enormous leverages through the vehicle of the Chinese Communist Party, which even in its private companies are a key instrument, as well as other state level things like coordinating committees. I mean, the Chinese can basically adversely touch just about anybody that it wants to do something. And so what you've seen is China's been relatively agile in at least signaling where it wants and guiding where its enterprises go. And there's that clear perception also in Latin America that where Chinese state companies go is somehow related to the state. And if you talk badly about what the Chinese are doing with respect to Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang or the crushing of democracy in Hong Kong or other affairs, or the essentially overrunning of the territorial rights of others in the South China Sea, East China Sea, that those types of criticisms might undermine your ability to get Chinese investment. And so there's that clear kind of perception of this linkage between how you talk about the Chinese state and getting those investments or partners. Now you contrasted that with the United States, although I liken it to herding cats, if you will. We have certain mechanisms like the Development Finance Corporation to try to facilitate or guide private sector investors into certain places. But we ultimately have limited capabilities if we want good U.S. private sector investment in a certain country. We can't force the private sector to do what it does not want to do. Also, there's a perception issue with respect to if you can talk badly about the U.S. administration. That probably doesn't mean that ExxonMobil is going to not invest in your country if there's money to be made. And so that perceived link means that enormous power of U.S. private sector investment is not always necessarily tied to what the disposition is toward the U.S. government, nor does the U.S. government always effectively kind of support or protect in the exclusive way that it could its private sector companies. But in a more broad sense, I think there's a number of ways in which, unfortunately, our policy in competing with China, although it's getting better, has been, I would say, off message, under resourced, and broken in terms of authorities. Under resourced, certainly in the sense that we've long put the majority of our both study money and thought money, and indeed government programs, whether USAID or others, or Defense Department programs in other regions, in Asia, in the Middle East, et cetera, and that has an impact on Latin America. In addition to that, you have, I would say, difficulties with the messaging. Again, we kind of ratcheted up the China is bad message, and I think we've done better in trying to provide some more empirical, data-based evidence of the performance of Chinese companies relative to non-Chinese alternatives, and some of the nature of the risks, for example, the digital risk. But by and large, Latin American countries, they know that Chinese actors are predatory. They aren't necessarily enamored with the Chinese system. But in my judgment, what I've seen is that the Latin American states have their own calculations of whether they think they can control the risk to get the benefit. And so what I would say is that we, the US, have not been as effective as we could in the messaging that actually speaks to why Latin American states make some of the decisions they do. And oftentimes there's a tendency in Latin America to basically, if they want the personal benefit, if they want the project with a Chinese company, and they believe they can control the risk, being able to deflect the United States criticism by saying, okay, that's just great power competition and great power politics. It's just business. We don't want to get involved in that. That in many ways becomes a way for them to dismiss those concerns with their own publics, and to engage with the Chinese as they want, which ironically in many ways is turning a blind eye to some of the very real risks and questions that they're getting themselves into. But aside from the messaging, the third thing that I would emphasize is really, again, the broken nature of some of the institutions. And so if you look at, for example, the Development Finance Corporation, I remember, again, during the Trump administration, the original idea of creating the DFC in conjunction with a program that was called America Crece, America Grows, basically together, was to try to more effectively and on greater scale and more quickly channel money that was really just being sent in little dribs and drabs by U.S. Export-Import Bank and OPIC and other smaller agencies. The problem was that some of that initial progress, the Biden administration, for very meritorious reasons, said, okay, hey, we've got this stream of private sector finance, but it's really important that goes mostly to lesser developed countries, that goes to vulnerable groups, whether it's indigenous or women or other vulnerable groups. The dilemma that's actually created is that with the desire to channel private sector money to do social good, which is entirely laudable, but it comes up to the conflict of the reasons why the private sector invests in certain places, which is about making money. And so the result has been that conflict has limited the efficacy of the DFC in other programs, just because of that inherent conflict. And we can go on and on with DOD. We actually have enormously constraining laws for good reasons, whether it's Leahy vetting in terms of human rights abuses, or obliging our partners to come up with really programs if they want something from us, explain why this is what it is. You have, so for example, with security assistance, you have something called Section 333 authority, which obliges you to do a number of different things that promote democracy and human rights and et cetera, in any program. The Chinese don't have to do that. The Chinese, hey, you need some bulletproof vests, and maybe the deal benefits your family personally. Well, happy to do it. And so the difficulty is, and similar things with USAID has stood up a China facing organization, but it's still kind of working through, okay, what is the relationship between doing good and helping to empower people to make good choices with respect to China. Commerce has some programs, but the difficulty is the question of authorities and funding and all these things. And again, starting out at that disadvantage that we're basically herding cats, government with private sector money. When you combine that herding cats with the limited resources and the conflicts in terms of authority and institutions, we're just really kind of paralyzed before the just tidal wave of Chinese money, and the really the momentum when people look at China in the region as the great savior, and look at the United States as is really not offering anything. So it's kind of an unfair perception, but when you're up against that perception and you're trying to deliver, then those are some of the constraints that, at least in my judgment, have prevented us from being more effective in waging that struggle.
I'm going to be a little bit provocative and push back on something you mentioned concerning the democracy anti-corruption laws. As great as they might be, there seems to become a point when US is not satisfied with democratic, pro-Western style of governance. And here I see a contradiction. We've had opportunities in recent years with various leaders who did not have any apparent transparency problems in the elections. I'm talking about for El Salvador, for instance, now Argentina, who have not had any particular clear issues in problematic issues other than we don't like them. We don't like their style of government. We don't like their rhetoric, and we, meaning the US government, don't particularly care for how they present themselves, and that's all there is to it. So we seem to have been losing opportunities even where we have a clear advantage, where we have countries that want to cooperate with the US. We seem to be shying away from the leaders there simply because there is either a personality, a style, or a messaging difference. So how do we overcome this hurdle of over idealizing political relationships?
No, this is a great point, and it's a very complex issue. And as you recall, many ways that the issue today is different from, but reminiscent of what happened during the Cold War, when we essentially supported certain dictatorships because they, were holding the line against, the advance of communism. But the perception that we were supporting these dictatorships, had their own costs. And the criticisms of others who allowed leftist governments to come to power in ways that, advanced communism or advanced the Soviet position, even though we did it in the name of democracy or social justice. And so I think today we have some of those same trade-offs. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, in the general response to China, there's a real lack of thinking about the strategic thinking, or what is our strategic concept in Latin America? What are those appropriate trade-offs? I, for one, believe that we absolutely have to have some element of value-based leadership, or else we're lost. I mean, we can never win against the Chinese for reasons that we just explained by being entirely, transactional, that we're just going to offer, more or more quickly. Our government, in terms of our messaging and our ability to channel private sector, will never win that fight. If you remember that, the Soviet Union in the Cold War, I mean, to me, part of what really was key for us was that there was I think, a fundamental belief in terms of internal to the countries, that there was something about democracy, in Western style democracy, and the protection of human rights, et cetera, and a concept long lost in these days, the reliance on a primarily market-driven economy to produce human innovation and to best protect rights against the advance of government. And so I think in many ways it was many of those values, not just the US, that was critical in the global response in the Cold War. But the problem is that today, that I think, although I think that values are important, it also happens to do with how we advance values in this new context. And so, number one, I think oftentimes that we want to push a certain concept of democracy. And what we find is that when China has this very powerful, credible counter-economic offer, where if the elites can sell to their people that the U.S. is just being a bully, and we, you shouldn't have to do things just because the U.S. want them to. And so it's pretty easy for the elites to allow themselves to take Chinese money and continuing to be just as corrupt as they want in the name of national autonomy. And so the existence of the Chinese offer, undermines our ability to essentially force partners to do things democratically. I mean, we all remember the democracy summit when certain people didn't come, and in those criticisms. In addition to that, I think what you have is China has pushed back with a very subversive but effective response. So it's not like the Soviet Union, where the Soviets said we want to advance this counter concept of political and economic organization called communism. I mean, yeah, they called themselves democratic, but nobody actually believed that the People's Democratic Republics were either about the people or democratic. But what the Chinese have done, especially with what they call their global civilization initiative and some of the rhetoric, is to say, well, sure, democracy is good and rights are good, but we don't think that we can really say who's right or wrong. And that's very subversive and very attractive to illiberal states, because if you say, well, of course, we're all for democracy, but if you can't say that a country has violated the democratic rights of its people or its own constitution, if it's enormously popular for a country like Russia, where China is unwilling to call out Russia for its brutal invasion of Ukraine, or unwilling to call out for example Hamas for the horrific terrorist attacks, or frankly unwilling to call out Venezuela for its bullying on the resolved issue of international law in Esquivel, and so in many ways saying, well, we can't decide who's right and wrong. When you don't have enforceable democracy, you don't have democracy itself. And so where I'm going with all of this is this idea that we are strategically challenged, number one, to figure out how to navigate that, to stand for certain values in a way that the region actually recognizes and responds and believes in, without essentially just coming across as a bully that can be essentially outmaneuvered by local elites who cast us as just trying to tell the countries what to do. Now, having said that, there's also another dimension, which is that we have to make some strategic decisions, and different governments, Democratic, Republican, make different calls on these type of things. But we have all kinds of dilemmas in countries like previously like Guatemala, the degree to which they are clearly moving in an anti-democratic direction, but at the same time they cast themselves as a holdout in not turning away from Taiwan. You have, of course, countries like El Salvador, which again Bukele has achieved remarkable successes against insecurity in El Salvador, and wants to be pro-U.S., but again his activities have caused deep discomfort. And I think, unfortunately, some of the difficulties that we're getting into is that the question of when partners are supporting our strategic interests or when partners are aligned with our values, and those are not always completely different things. I mean, some of the core issues have to do with social justice and environment right now, versus some of the hard politics issues. And so a country like Brazil, for example, which Lula is clearly aligned with the Biden administration on issues of environmental protection and social justice, and yet clearly the way that Lula has positioned Brazil in terms of the embrace of China, or frankly some very unhelpful positions with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, et cetera, or the Middle East, fundamentally undermine the strategic U.S. position in the hemisphere. And you can find other areas where we're trying to, again, make peace with the social justice issues of Petro in Colombia, and yet Petro is moving in ways that are creating open doors for Venezuela. So again, at the end of the day, and I won't say that there is any clear right and wrong, but it's not only the how do we more effectively lead with values in this challenged concept, but also how do we navigate that space and trade-off between trying to work with regimes that coincide with us on certain issues, versus also supporting regimes that we might find distasteful in some ways, but are helping us to hold the line strategically. It's a question of how does the U.S. stay by its friends, and how does the U.S. decide what its friends are? And I think the current era makes that entirely complicated. So I may not have entirely answered your question, but I think it really is core to the effectiveness of the U.S. response, both against China, or at least as a competitor to China, but also really with the U.S. long-term relationship to the region as a whole in this new era.
I think at some point US will have to determine where its priorities lie, whether how it defines democracy, first of all, at what point does it reach, okay, we can accept this and then we can work together to build it up to, why, without being seen as demanding, but rather as offering partnerships, improvements, best practices, and so forth. But I think we don't necessarily have our priorities straight, because some of the things, some of the regimes we have supported are by far worse in terms of human rights and democracies than some of the places we supposedly find distasteful. And the issue may simply be as much simply political differences and not necessarily any of these underlying core values themselves. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves about that. But all of that presents a much bigger challenge than these individual relationships, meaning the security landscape arising from a lack of core underlying support. And one of the issues, going back to something you said earlier, was China's willingness to invest into Latin American militaries, something that we used to do quite comprehensively, but now it's not clear where we stand on that, and at the very least we're being significantly, I've heard the number 5 times, fivefold outspent by China. So what does that mean for us in terms of military engagement with our next door neighbors, and the fact that an authoritarian country with clearly anti-Western inclinations is investing so much into these militaries in a landscape where we have terrorist organizations, organized crime, cartels, and all these actors in close proximity?
No, it's a great question. And in general, China's military engagement is certainly a much smaller component than its economic engagement. However, it is still important. And I tend to regard the essential impact of China's overall engagement, including commercial engagement and political engagement, on the character of our partners is what is strategically most impactful. What do I mean by that? Oftentimes we U.S. military focus on this idea of maintaining partner of choice relationships, that we want to have democratic partners who see us as providing the best military benefits and the best other benefits. And back in the Cold War, one used to compete in our own lanes. I mean, we would work with our military partners, trying to provide them adequate training, et cetera, to allow friendly governments to, resist, subversive, communist movements, guerrilla movements, et cetera, et cetera. The challenges today and the whole dynamic of what matters in terms of the military dimension of the competition is much different than it was, back in the Cold War. So first, important to just say, well, what is the nature of Chinese military competition? And in general, what you find is the levels are small, but it's mostly about building relationships. And so, especially with anti-U.S. populist states, the Chinese have indeed, sold some weapon system. I mean, they sold K-8 fighters to Venezuela. They sold JYL-1 radars. Under the populist Rafael Correa government in Ecuador, they sold a large number of military trucks as well as radars, although that didn't work out too well. Bolivia with Evo Morales, they sold, military helicopters and armored vehicles and other things. With Argentina, they almost sold their most advanced fighter, sold yet to the hemisphere, the JF-17, otherwise known as the FC-1, although that's off the table for right now. But so the point that's interesting about this is that the cause effect is that it was the political receptivity to China by authoritarian governments that opened up the door for the military more than the Chinese military sales opening up the door for that. Now, The other part of that, however, is that once those governments are in, you find that the willingness to engage in security cooperation. So, especially not only security systems. I mean, the selling of Venezuela, things like the VN1 armored personnel carriers and other things that they use to repress their own people in protests, but also digital control systems. And so the way that Cuba was able to shut down national protests in July 2021 is its telecommunications firm Ectesa was able to leverage the material that had been provided by Huawei and other Chinese companies to basically cut off protesters using cell phones and email from each other and from the outside world. There are other examples. I mean, in Venezuela, the much talked about Carnet de la Patria, the fatherland identity card that you need to have and register with the state to get any type of either food and supply boxes or to get vaccines and other things like that. Some nationwide social control systems like ECU 911 in Ecuador under Rafael Correa, or BOL 110 in Bolivia, basically nationwide surveillance systems. So the Chinese do, once a state, authoritarian state gets in, provide certain things that help those authoritarian states to better control their own people, in addition to the economic support that they give to keep them alive. And so there's that piece. But if you go more broadly, there's also the Chinese do a lot of gifting, even with states that are friendly. And this is not only militaries, but police forces. It's typically things like dual-use military trucks and buses, sometimes construction equipment that you need for military construction and road building. The Chinese especially have done a lot of work with police forces. And so, Dominican Republic, I remember 140 motorcycles and a small number of armored vehicles. The Guyana police force, it was something similar. I think in Costa Rica, it was 250 squad cars. In Panama, just recently, I was down there. The Chinese provided 6,000 Kevlar vests and associated helmets to the Panamanian National Police and their border force, Senafront, and their Air and Naval Service, Sanan. So the issue is that the police forces and others, they need these equipment, but it also kind of opens up doors of goodwill, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the relationship that becomes important later. Now, on top of that, you have countless visits by the Chinese, from their national defense universities and others to their counterparts in the region who say, well, China's an important power, so of course we want to hear their perspective. Now, reciprocally, what's a little bit more troubling is you have a lot of people-to-people diplomacy where they will bring people to their short courses, 3 to 5 week courses in Chongqing. And again, it's really more about tourism and eating well and developing relationships than the quality of the course. But again, it builds relationships. It opens up some military members to compromise. It allows them to be assessed, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are some presence operations. So the Chinese spent 8 years with their military police in Minasta. They have a hospital ship that's visited the region 3 times in 2011, 2015, and 2018, 2019. They periodically send ships. In 2013, they sent their missile frigate, 2 missile frigates around the Straits of Magellan. So you have these kind of low-level activities, but to me, it's not on the order of it was in the Soviet Union. But why is it still important, and what's the role? And so what I would come back to is again, in peacetime, it doesn't, the Chinese at least overtly are not yet looking for bases like they have established in Djibouti, very close to the Suez Canal. But if, for example, and we know that Xi Jinping is very highly motivated to use China's military superiority to try to, bully, or maybe even, through military action, end the autonomy of Taiwan before the end of Xi's 3rd term in 2027. I mean, Xi knows that everyone in China says, well, who is China's great leader? Is it, Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping? And so in many ways, essentially, doing away with that last kind of scar on, the completion of China's restoration project, ending the autonomy of Taiwan is really kind of completing that picture, and putting Xi up there is the great. And so given that motivation is very strong, certainly the possibilities we've seen now with the overflights and incursions of ships and missile tests in Taiwanese waters, that if there were a fight, that fight would almost certainly not be fought just in the Indo-Pacific. It would be fought wherever, China has global capabilities. Now, in the Western Hemisphere, that might initially involve economic pressures to get states to deny the use, not allow the United States use to their ports or airspace in the name of neutrality. But it might also involve things like leveraging Chinese commercial facilities or military facilities, such as the electronic intelligence facility that they have in Cuba, in Bejucal, to try to observe and potentially even use special teams to disrupt, flows of forces or sustainment coming out of the U.S., maybe even put the U.S. homeland itself at risk. There'd certainly be other issues like, for example, using their knowledge that comes from operating on both sides of the Panama Canal to maybe shut down the Panama Canal, probably in a deniable way that the Chinese couldn't be overtly blamed for. And for example, if the Panama Canal was shut down, the alternative transit then is around the Straits of Magellan in the south of Argentina and Chile. And there it's relevant that you have a private Chinese port project. And so, you can imagine the possibility of with containerized shipping, smuggling some anti-ship missiles and things like that to basically put commercial shipping in the Straits of Magellan at risk. I mean, we see now how, the Houthi rebels in Yemen can, shut down the Red Sea traffic just with a few missiles. And so when you start putting all of those things together and you go even beyond that, let's say that in a more advanced stage of the war, if things don't go well initially for Taiwan, and now there's the question of the Chinese trying to project threats against the U.S. in a continuing war. Places like the port of Chancay in Peru, which is not a Chinese base, but could be used with or against the will of a future Peruvian government, to essentially resupply and project naval power, Chinese naval power against the U.S. West Coast and others. And so where I'm going with all of this, and also should just mention also Chinese access to space. I mean, in a global war, there would be a counter space fight to identify U.S. satellites over the Western Hemisphere to try to eavesdrop on their communications, maybe even to try to take them out. And so in all of those types of things, Chinese access to space in the Western Hemisphere would be strategically valuable. But the bottom line is the question becomes, if China is called upon to do these things, if the PLA is called upon to do these things as part of this global war fight, how quickly could they do them? And what I would argue is that their relationships with Latin American militaries, their familiarity with the operating environment, everything that they're doing today in terms of the people that they bring over to Chongping, the visits that they make, the port calls, things like that, that all increases those relationships and allows them to more quickly and effectively move towards actually projecting those threats. So again, it's not that there's major military presence by China right now in the hemisphere, but those activities and the relationships create enormous strategic vulnerabilities, especially when you combine them with the strategic military opportunities that you get from the commercial presence. Again, try to distinguish between, for example, in electronic intelligence, a person who's coming into a Huawei facility saying that he is a Huawei engineer versus a, MSS, cyber warfare, expert. And so, the commercial creates all kinds of possibilities for the Chinese as well. And so to me, so it's not the quantity of the military, it's the risks that it creates in wartime, which I think are substantial and growing, frankly.
And one of the issues that you referenced earlier, the telecom sectors, specifically, my understanding it's, first of all, it's becoming increasingly controlled by China, but second, it has a dual use as well, not only in the immediate commercial/intelligence gathering capacity, but as a military, as part of a potential military infrastructure that would give China extreme advantage. And it seems to me that China is building this network towards that particular goal and not just as a sort of, so what does it tell us about China's intentions, the fact that they are preparing something that could very easily be militarized? And what impact does it have on U.S. security intelligence gathering operations currently?
Sure. Well, and let me just start with your point about telecom because it's very, very important. I think often misunderstood. As we mentioned before, the 2017 China National Intelligence Law basically obliges any Chinese company or company operating in China that if they have data that's of use to the Chinese state, they're obliged to turn it over. Now, we've seen in multiple occasions that the Chinese understands that this commercial information is strategic. Just one quick example, something as innocuous as the information that's gathered by the rideshare firm Didi Chuxing on where it takes its different different users and what they could tell you about who's meeting with who or even opportunities for compromising somebody if you know where they're going that they're not supposed to be going. So China recognized last year, actually 2 years ago, that this data from Didi was so valuable that they actually obliged Didi to essentially turn over its data to a organization more aligned with the Chinese state. Or, for example, in China's new what they call the Global Security Initiative, they explicitly call out standards for data control as part of their security initiative. So they understand that there's a militarized purpose. Now, what I would say, and again, understanding the level of penetration in Latin America that this has achieved. This is not just a here and there. Something like 60% of the entire internet backbone of China, they've been there for, again, more than 20 years, is equipment from Huawei and other Chinese firms, ZTE among others. Again, you combine that with safe cities and smart cities, but more importantly, the ubiquitous nature of Chinese security systems devices such as by Hikvision in Dahua. And again, it's not just government projects, but I mean, these are some of the most common providers. And you say, well, all of that data that, in terms of your, home security cameras and facial recognition, that's getting offloaded to a server someplace, oftentimes in China. And again, the list goes on and on. I mean, ZPMC is a port crane operator. It's the industry standard made in China, but they have cameras that basically scan the little chips on every single container that comes through the port. And so again, where is that data getting offloaded about the ownership patterns and the technical characteristics of every single thing that comes in through every single container in a port where, ZPMC cranes are the standard, or things like NUCTEC, the Chinese customs scanner technology that, can again get interesting information about everything that passes through one of those airport or other scanners, whether it's your laptop computer or other things. So again, we could go on and on about this, but the real core issue is that the potential Chinese access to data, and it's getting worse as the Chinese develop this strategic weight, and begin to increasingly set the standards and things like 5G and artificial intelligence, and consciously do so. They actually had a strategic policy called China Standards 2035, where they understand the importance of doing this. But the risks, there are peacetime risks as well as wartime risks. So in peacetime, we recognize that China has long used both the state and its intelligence services, the MSS, to try to capture as many trade secrets and other things from its from Western industry as possible, not just Western governments, to advance essentially the status of Chinese industry, both on the defense side and in other sides. I mean, very few companies actually operate these days in China with their intellectual property over there because they understand that China is actively trying by going after its people, going after its technology digitally, of stealing its technology and then basically giving its technology to a competing company that is going to push it out of the market. But those same things apply with that digital vulnerability in Latin America. So you have a thing, Huawei has 9 cloud computing systems centers in Latin America. They're very big in cloud computing, and they're trying to say, hey, to Latin American tech companies, locate your sensitive processes and core intellectual property in the Huawei cloud. We'll give you a great deal. Well, again, the same vulnerabilities. And so in peacetime, what you get is this Chinese digital domination facilitates essentially China's global advance to win contracts because, if you know what your competitor's offer is, if you know what their technical characteristics and vulnerabilities are, if you can compromise, commercial personnel, if you can actually, steal their blueprints and designs outside of China itself, then you get commercial advantage. But it's also the ability of our partners to make sovereign decisions in peacetime. So it is, for example, again, you think about that Didi Chuxung rideshare example. Think of the person taking a Didi taxi and talking on his Huawei phone as he goes to the red light district to meet with his mistress. The Chinese now have something on the vice minister, for example, who's going to decide that delicate procurement decision. And that's when you get into China's having conversations about, win-win deals. And so at the end of the day, it's not just about military secrets. It undercuts the ability of our partners to do things that are fundamental to their own making of private sovereign decisions. Now, you're absolutely right. In wartime, there is yet another series of risks on top of that, which is the security of information that is passed through those networks. It is knowledge and the ability to compromise and impact military leaders and military partners, political partners, to know what they're deciding in terms of cooperating with the United States or no. Maybe pressure key people to not allow the U.S. to have access, or to allow the Chinese to have access to a certain port facility. So even aside from military movements or military secrets, there are many ways in which, in that wartime scenario I talked about before, that digital access and the ability to extort and manipulate has a lot of value. And so absolutely, I see that digital vulnerability, something which is enormous but continues to grow, is really fundamental in both peacetime and in wartime. Working with our Latin American partners for the both the commercial prosperity but also the security of the hemisphere.
And speaking of vulnerabilities, there's been a few mysterious reports by the Wall Street Journal in the course of the past year about a military slash intelligence base in Cuba, supposedly masterminded by China, and other similar reports. And then there's been zero follow-up. We have no, if there are spies in Cuba, Chinese spies in Cuba, what are we doing about it? Can we do anything about it? Who are they? Why don't we know more? I mean, what's the story with all these reports?
That's interesting. And of course, I'm familiar with the reports. While I can't confirm or deny the veracity of the reports themselves, I can tell you academically, going back to the early 2000s, this was something that was hotly debated and generally referred to as is understood that the Chinese had been granted some access by the Cubans to various listening facilities, Bejucal, Lourdes, maybe also the computing facility in Santiago de Cuba. We also knew from open press that the Chinese, before they set up Confucius Institutes in other places, established one of their first Confucius Institutes in the region in Cuba, and used to send literally thousands of Chinese government personnel to Cuba, basically to be educated in the Spanish language in Cuban institutions to facilitate their development of awareness in the region, because Cuba was considered a safe place. And so I think, although the Chinese have only had limited commercial activities with the Cubans, because there really wasn't much of a commercial case when Cuba didn't have access to U.S. markets because of the embargo. I mean, the Chinese scrambled to play catch up and expand their activities in Cuba after the Obama administration opening to Cuba back in 2015. But aside from that brief window, what you see is that there have long been party-to-party negotiations. There have long been military coordination. There have long been these what would appear to be this type of access. And it's not just the access to what they call the ELINT, the electronic intelligence that you can capture from U.S. transmissions, which are relatively close by, just across the water there in places like Florida, and also from overhead satellites potentially. But it's also about again, the ability to maintain the one place that there's evidence that the Chinese are thinking about maintaining a semi-permanent military presence close to the U.S. This supposed training cooperation with Cubans. This would imply, again, a rotating but probably semi-permanent presence if it occurs, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, of Chinese forces. Which, and again, are they trainers, or are they actual special operations or other types of forces that can conduct or coordinate other activities in time of war? Could that turn Cuba into kind of one of the points of command, if you will, in the context of a war against the United States? I mean, that would certainly make a certain amount of sense. Although there are other places as well where the Chinese are economically dominant that receive less attention. We can talk about we can talk about for example, Antigua and Barbuda. We can talk about Grenada. We can talk about Dominica, et cetera, et cetera. But so there are clearly a wide range of those type of activities involving Cuba. Now, the Cubans are leery of the Chinese. They're economically desperate, but they're leery because I think they recognize that Chinese intelligence and Chinese activities have an agenda that doesn't entirely correspond with the Cuban agenda. And so it's interesting. You see, I think that the Cubans have long they've embraced the Chinese, but there's a certain level of mistrust or caution. But certainly it is one of the key places, and that's one of the reasons why I look also at Nicaragua right now, because to me, Nicaragua, which just became a strategic partner with the Chinese, and which is moving forward on a number of different projects with potential military applications, including the Punta Horta airport, among others. And of course, as we know, the Ortegas, who are internationally isolated, now increasingly dependent on the Chinese, moving forward with a lot of developmental projects. But the Ortegas have shown themselves willing to do military engagement with the Russians, with the Iranians, and others. And so what I suspect also is, as the Nicaragua-China relationship is now flowering, this opens up a new front for the Chinese relatively close to the United States, with a dependent regime, and a regime which frankly has much lower of a level of sophistication and capability to essentially resist Chinese machinations than does Cuba with their DGI, with their intelligence and other services. And so Cuba, I see, is an important piece, although it's not the only piece in the strategic component of China's advance, which again is not the main part of China's advance, but it is China creating options in wartime if they need to go to war against the United States.
Speaking of war against the United States, some would argue that an intelligence war is already being fought. And some would point to the so-called Havana syndrome. The CIA denied that any state actor's involvement or any evidence of sonic weapons being used to perpetrate that, but it's been increasing since 2016, and it's been from Cuba. It spread all over the world and mysteriously only targets certain Western diplomats and intelligence officers and nobody else in the vicinity, which would not be the case had it been some medical condition or virus. So the question is, and given that it's happening all over the world, it should probably be either Russia, China, or some combination of both, and very few other candidates to have advancements of that type. So the question is, it's fairly obvious why US does not want to publicly confront these actors about something like that. But has there been any effective counterpoint? Has there been anything done to contain this sort of activity? And what does it say about the level of aggression and capability that during peacetime, without any open confrontations, and that was before the second invasion of Ukraine, and certainly before the current escalation around South China Sea, that it all started, given that it all started at a relatively peaceful time, how potent is the threat now? What can we talk about our capabilities versus potential confrontation in these shadow spheres?
Well, again, I remember from my own time at State, and especially under the Trump administration, awareness and looking into and concern over what the Cuban government was probably doing with respect to sonic attacks was a very real issue. And I know that there are many people who are deeply frustrated that the issue has not received more attention. Although certainly a state continues to to take that seriously and do whatever it can for the protection of its own personnel. But what you also allude to goes back to the broader question of how does one define war or struggle? But certainly there's, I think, an understanding that the U.S. has long been in a protracted struggle, if not an explicitly military one, with a range of different actors. With respect to Russian information operations activities looking to undermine pro-U.S. democracies, indications of possible Russian meddling through bots and trolls, and as well as their kind of disinformation periodicals, RT and Sputnik, in places like Colombia and places like Costa Rica. Again, oftentimes trying to polarize and confuse and undermine democracy rather than traditional propaganda. But certainly similar issues with respect to the Cubans and the Venezuelans, and possibly role by the Russians in the what I would call the weaponization of protests. I mean, certain indications that in 2019, although certainly there were legitimate reasons for being concerned with respect to the protests in Ecuador, the question of why protesters decided the thing to do was to try to converge on a strategically key facility to shut down the Sote pipeline, or to try to essentially trap the government and take out some important cell phone and other communications equipment in the capital, Quito. In Chile, a similar thing in October 2019, in those pre-COVID days, when a very small increase in metro fare in Bogota ended up I'm sorry, in Santiago, in the capital of Chile, led to a seemingly spontaneous nationwide response in which protesters across the country, whose metro prices had not been at all raised, were burning down metro stations and bus stations and things like that. And so I think across the region, in a number of these types of activities that are driven by legitimate frustrations and inequality and other concerns, there's a sense that in the organization and the weaponization, similar things with the protests in Panama over Cobre Panama. It's not that these frustrations are not real, but a concern that certain actors in the region have long been engaged in a struggle to try to essentially undermine and limit pro-democratic actors in advance of another agenda. Now, the question of to what degree is Russia engaged, or to what degree is China playing an active role? My sense is that China has been less overt and less aggressive, from what I've seen, than Russia in those types of explicitly anti-democratic activities. I think the Chinese recognize that they have more economically to lose in the region if they are perceived as doing these type of things. But that's not to say that the Chinese are not doing them. But in terms of what the U.S. response has been, there's only a limited amount, of course, that I can say on that. I mean, this is a very hard issue, of course, to work. But certainly one can see that in the messaging space, you have organizations like the Global Engagement Center within the State Department and others really trying to put out counter messaging to try to counter some of these perceptions, and of course, certainly the protection of diplomatic personnel and others. And so I think there's an awareness in trying to work some of these problems. I think things like thinking about what a war with China looks like in the Western Hemisphere is just in its infancy, but I think it's a fundamental question. So I would hesitate to say that things are not being done, but I think with respect to the magnitude of the difficulties in the region, and some of the action by not just China but a range of different actors, we certainly have our work cut out for us, and intelligent people, I think, within and outside the administration will differ strongly on whether the Biden administration is doing enough, whether they are coddling certain authoritarian actors that represent broader threats in the name of short-term benefits. I mean, the idea of negotiations with the Maduro regime in Venezuela to release U.S. Hostages and get commitments to return to democracy comes in mind. And so it certainly exposed some, I think, profound disagreements within the U.S. political system about what the appropriate policy responses are. But I think these are things that are certainly being worked, whether you disagree or agree with the responses. That they certainly are being worked by the government, but they're very hard problems.
Well, speaking of the devil, and just brought up Venezuela, I have two last questions for you related to very specific problems that we are facing, not in a theoretical distant, but in a very immediate future. The first, of course, is Venezuela's bankruptcy has led it to essentially try to towards a power grab of Guyana, all to pay Chinese billions in Chinese loans that they owe. And I've heard stories about a Chinese defense company basically taking over portions of Venezuela's oil apparatus and things like that. And it's not clear where that's going. And China may not necessarily be pushing for war specifically, but it is certainly an outcome of its engagement in the region as well as Venezuela's mismanagement of its own affairs. And the second, somewhat related issue is the issue of fentanyl. US and China have concluded an agreement about combating that issue. Supposedly, China acknowledged its willingness to work on that problem, but how can it when it's essentially weaponized the fentanyl and its relationships with cartels specifically to cause problems? How are these two immediate issues going to be handled by the US, and who is going to be handling them? Is it going to be the military? Is it going to be the diplomatic effort? Is it going to be a security approach? What are we looking at here?
Sure. No, well, first of all, the what you mentioned with respect to Venezuela goes back to the fundamental question of what is China's posture with respect to anti-US populist regimes. And what I've seen over the years is that China tends to be somewhat cautious because, first of all, commercially, China benefits enormously, although dealing with these regimes is a big headache because, just getting projects, completion signed off on, and the insecurity in the countries. I remember talking with people in different Chinese firms who had done business with Venezuela, just telling me what a nightmare it was to operate under first Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro. But having said that, I think politically, China, much like what it does in North Korea and elsewhere, China is not in any hurry to help the United States to resolve its own problems. And so while China doesn't want to become tarred with being seen as involved in an anti-US alliance with Venezuela, so it maintains a certain amount of distance. And indeed, it even selectively cooperated with the US on sanctions because it knew that its companies were vulnerable elsewhere. And indeed, that was one of the things that happened during the Trump administration, where you actually saw that the Chinese, that used to be CNPC, the China National Petroleum Corporation, that dealt directly with the oil fields, and then to avoid their exposure to sanctions from that oil, what they then did is they stopped taking delivery on oil themselves, and a Chinese defense-related company called KDEC, I believe, began to basically hire its own tankers. This is an industry that had never been in, but they were a defense company, so they had limited exposure to U.S. sanctions. And so they would take delivery on Venezuelan oil, they would take it off to the coast of Malaysia, and they would basically hide the origin through a ship-to-ship transfer of oil off of Malaysia and make it look like China was importing Malaysian oil and not Venezuelan oil. So the Chinese, both in terms of explicitly trying to avoid getting caught up in anti-US activity, and also surreptitiously trying to keep cooperating while hiding it. It's a pattern like North Korea, where again the Chinese are content to just allow authoritarian partners to create messes up until the point where those messes start to infringe on basic Chinese interests. So the Chinese were happy dealing with the North Koreans up to the point where some of the provocations led the United States to deploy the high altitude air defense system THAAD in South Korea. Then the Chinese got interested. I think the same thing with Venezuela. The Chinese are happy as long as they cannot get themselves into trouble working with the Venezuelans. And so as the Venezuelan regime, Maduro regime, now seems to be getting more of a blessing from the Biden administration with the lifting of sanctions and re-engagement, you see the Chinese also, like with the Russians, beginning to re-engage. And I think that applies across the board with China's posture towards Nicaragua, China's posture towards Cuba, in other actors. And so again, I think they try to kind of play it both ways with respect to that. With respect to the question of fentanyl, Again, I think like with the anti-US state actors, the Chinese were not in any hurry to help the United States out in a grave problem that is fundamentally undermining US society. Do I believe that there is a Chinese master plan to destroy the United States through fentanyl? I personally doubt it. But given that the problem was there, I mean, I remember that when we put a lot of pressure on the Chinese through State Department, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, they reluctantly started taking some actions to reduce direct fentanyl shipments from China, from Wuhan specifically to the United States. Of course, that was when it started increasingly going through pill presses in labs via their Mexican partners, Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación, into the United States, that way creating the current issues. Now, after the recent summit, and this was made an issue both for by the Biden administration and then with some of the dialogue with Mexico, you see a similar thing where I think the Chinese are taking some steps to kind of increased supervision of some of their large number of chemical companies that could be involved. It is a very hard problem, but I mean, this is a country that can control 1.4 billion people and what they write on the internet. So to say that you can't control a few thousand petrochemical companies, I think is disingenuous. But so there's a little bit of progress on that, and I think the U.S. continues to apply those diplomatic pressures. And so I think some headway has been made on that, but again, the question of should China do more? Why doesn't China do more? And frankly, on the fentanyl issue specifically, I think we may have opportunity for some strengthened cooperation, not only now with AMLO, because AMLO recognizes that this is important, and like migration, once AMLO has seen that something's important, he kind of reluctantly tries to help us out. But I think there's space for expanded security cooperation and work on fentanyl when the likely victor of Mexico's 2024 election, Claudia Sheinbaum, takes office, because I sense that she may have a somewhat less anti-US posture and thus be more willing to cooperate there. So some things are being done. I mean, I see these issues being worked by again, across the board, state defense. I mean, these are issues that certainly General Richardson at Southcom, understands. Of course, talking about Mexico, General Van Herrick, commander of Northcom, understands well. Again, you see, these are clearly things that people like Juan Gonzalez, it's state under Jake Sullivan. Juan Gonzalez having responsibility for Western Hemisphere, I think is aware of and working, and certainly within WHA, people like Brian Nichols and his team there at State, and Brian, who I know is a very, very bright guy, and so again, these are hard problems being worked by very smart people. Now, is it enough? Are the decisions being made correct or not? I think people of different political perspectives would disagree, but I do have faith that these are issues that are being actively worked by the U.S. government.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a sobering but informative look at the survey of China's activity in Latin America. Of course, there's a lot more to be said on a country-by-country level, but I think it is important to get the broad perspective for audiences. We are seeing glimpses here and there, a lot of rhetoric, not always a lot of detail and substance in understanding how it all comes together and why it matters at all. And I think this was important to lay that foundation here. Thank you for your input. And to my audience, once again, I hope everyone has a great start to the new year. I hope we will see many breakthroughs on some of the complex problems that we've discussed, and opportunities for better courses of action. And tune in again next week, same time, 9 p.m. EST, to the Washington Outsider Report for our continuing programming of tackling issues that no one else necessarily wants to talk about, especially to this level of granular detail. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Irina. Pleasure to be on your show. Have a great evening, and look forward to continuing work with you. And thanks to your audience for their interest in this topic.
Thank you so much.